Did I really just hear her call me her boyfriend in front of her own parents? My name is Ryan Cooper. I'm 29, and 3 months earlier I'd moved into a quiet street in Westerville, Ohio, mostly to get away from a life in Cleveland that hadn't worked out the way I planned. I fixed servers for a small logistics company, worked long hours, and came home most nights to an apartment that still had unpacked boxes stacked against the wall. I barely knew anyone on my street. My neighbor was a friendly woman named Emily Hastings, a second-grade teacher who waved at me most mornings and once left a plate of cookies on my porch with a sticky note that said, "Welcome to the neighborhood." That Friday evening, I was heating up leftovers when there was a knock at my door. Emily stood there looking a little frazzled, her hair pulled back in a rushed ponytail. "Hey, could you possibly help me with something?" she asked. "My parents are coming for dinner tonight and I still have boxes sitting in the garage from when I moved in. I don't have anyone else to ask." It seemed harmless enough, so I grabbed my jacket and followed her over. Her garage was stacked with taped-up moving boxes, old furniture, and a bike with a flat tire leaning against the wall. We spent the next half hour hauling boxes into a spare room, sorting out what she needed and what could stay hidden. Emily talked the entire time, telling me about her students, about how her parents had been visiting twice a year since she moved to Ohio, about how her mother always managed to find something to worry about. She had an easy laugh and a way of making small talk feel less like small talk. When we finished, she wiped her hands on her jeans and thanked me, then hesitated at the door. "Actually, would you want to just stay for dinner?" she asked. "I have way too much food and it feels silly for you to walk back to an empty apartment." I didn't have any plans, so I said sure, thinking it would be a quiet meal with her and her parents before I headed home. 20 minutes later, a car pulled into her driveway and a well-dressed older couple climbed out, arms full of a casserole dish and a bottle of wine. Emily introduced them as her mother and father, Carol and Frank, and they greeted me with the kind of warm, curious smile you give someone you don't expect to see. We sat down at her small dining table, the smell of roasted chicken filling the kitchen, and for a while everything felt completely ordinary. Carol asked about my job, Frank asked how long I'd lived on the street, and I answered easily enough, still just the helpful new neighbor who'd been roped into dinner. Then, just as I reached for my water glass, Emily set down her fork, looked at her parents, and said, in a voice far too confident for what she was about to claim, "Mom, Dad, this is my boyfriend." The words hit me like a splash of cold water. I nearly choked on the sip I'd just taken, my fork clattering softly against the plate as I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh and say she was joking. She didn't. Her eyes were fixed on her parents, watching their reaction with an expression that was equal parts hope and panic, and I realized in that exact second she meant every word of it, and she needed me to go along with it. The table went completely silent for a moment, the kind of silence that feels louder than any conversation. Then Carol's face broke into pure delight, both hands flying up to her cheeks, while Frank leaned back in his chair with the satisfied look of a man whose daughter had finally settled down. Before I could open my mouth to correct anything, the questions started pouring in. "How did you two meet? How long have you been together? Does he treat you well, Emily? Why haven't you mentioned him before?" Emily answered some of it herself, filling gaps with details that sounded suspiciously smooth for someone supposedly caught off guard, which told me this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment slip. Under the table, her foot nudged mine, gentle but insistent, and when her parents got distracted arguing over whether the chicken needed more salt, she leaned toward me and whispered just 3 words. "Please, help me." I sat there running through my options. I could stand up right now and say, "Actually, we just met a few hours ago while I was hauling your daughter's boxes," and watch her humiliation unfold in real time in front of the 2 people she clearly wanted to impress most. Or I could play along for one dinner and let her explain everything once her parents left. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something underneath the panic that made my decision easy, a kind of quiet desperation that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with years of some unspoken pressure from these 2 people at the table. So I smiled, picked up my fork, and said we met through a mutual friend, actually, keeping it vague enough that Emily could fill in whatever backstory she needed later. For the rest of the meal I became, against all logic, Emily's boyfriend. I complimented Carol's cooking. I let Frank tell me a long story about his years working at a manufacturing plant in Michigan. I even laughed at a joke about my supposed nervousness meeting the parents for the first time. Emily kept glancing at me with something between gratitude and disbelief, like she couldn't quite believe I was actually doing this. When dessert came out, Carol reached across the table and squeezed my hand, telling me how relieved she was that Emily had finally found someone steady after everything with her last relationship. I had no idea what everything meant, but I nodded like I understood completely. Somewhere between the salad and the main course, Frank set down his fork, folded his hands, and asked the question I'd been dreading all night without even knowing it was coming. "So, Ryan, what are your intentions with my daughter?" The room seemed to tilt slightly. Emily's eyes went wide for a fraction of a second before she recovered, but I caught it, that flash of pure terror before she forced a smile back onto her face. I set my own fork down slowly, buying myself a second to think, and said the only thing that felt safe, that I cared about Emily a great deal and wasn't the type of person who took relationships lightly. It was vague enough to be true about almost anyone, but Frank nodded like I'd passed some kind of test, and Carol actually dabbed at the corner of her eye with her napkin, murmuring something about how she'd prayed for a man like me to come along. After dinner, while Emily helped her mother clear the table, Frank pulled out his phone and asked if we could take a picture together for the family group chat, since apparently an aunt in Michigan had been asking about this mysterious boyfriend for weeks. I stood beside Emily in her narrow kitchen, his phone camera raised, and she slipped her arm around my waist like it was the most natural thing in the world, her voice low enough for only me to hear. "Smile like you actually like me," she murmured through her teeth, and somehow that made it easier because for one photograph, pretending stopped feeling like pretending. Frank fired off the picture immediately, and within minutes Carol's phone buzzed with responses from relatives none of us had ever met, cousins and aunts already declaring how handsome we looked together, one of them typing finally in all capital letters as though Emily's single status had been a family crisis they'd all been quietly monitoring. By the time her parents finally said their goodbyes near the door, hugging me like I'd already been part of the family for years, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with moving boxes. The second the car pulled out of the driveway, Emily closed the door, turned around, and pressed her back against it, letting out a breath she'd clearly been holding all evening. "I'm so sorry," she said immediately. "I never meant to drag you into that. I told them months ago that I was seeing someone because they wouldn't stop asking, and I panicked when I saw you standing there tonight and it just came out." I asked her why she'd lied to them in the first place, and she admitted her parents had been pushing her about her love life for years, ever since a relationship in her 20s had ended badly and left her guarded. She'd made up a boyfriend during a phone call months ago just to get them to stop worrying, never expecting they'd plan a visit and expect to meet him. Standing in her kitchen, surrounded by leftover casserole and half-empty wine glasses, we ended up talking for 2 more hours, not about the dinner, but about everything else. Her years teaching second grade, my failed attempt at community college before I found my footing in tech support, the reasons we'd both ended up quietly rebuilding our lives on this particular street. It struck me, somewhere around midnight, that I'd learned more about Emily Hastings in one accidental evening than I had about most people I'd known for years. Just as I was about to head home, Emily's phone rang, and she glanced at the screen with a groan before answering. It was Carol, already back at the hotel, already talking about how thrilled she was, and before Emily could stop her, I heard the words, "wedding" and "cousin Danielle," and "bring Ryan," of course, drifting faintly from the speaker. Emily hung up looking slightly pale and explained that her cousin's wedding was in 6 weeks, and her mother had just informed the entire family that Emily's new boyfriend would be attending as her +1. I laughed at first, assuming she was exaggerating, until she showed me the text that followed a moment later, an actual save-the-date reminder with my name typed in next to hers under the guest list column. That's the moment it stopped feeling like a harmless white lie contained to one dinner and started feeling like something with an actual expiration date we'd have to plan around, one way or another. When I finally said goodnight and walked back across the yard to my own front door, I stopped for a second and looked back at her porch light, still confused about how a simple favor had turned into pretending to be someone's boyfriend, and even more confused about why some part of me didn't actually mind. Over the following weeks, Emily and I fell into an easy rhythm of texting, coffee on Saturday mornings, the occasional dinner that was no longer a performance for anyone else. One evening, sitting on her porch steps while her wind chimes clinked softly overhead, I asked her, half joking, if her parents ever found out the truth, would they be disappointed it started as a lie? She thought about it for a long moment, then looked at me and said, "Maybe it started as one, but it doesn't feel like one anymore." I told her I felt the same way, and for the first time since that chaotic dinner, neither of us needed to pretend anything at all. The cousin's wedding came faster than either of us expected, and by then there was no version of the story where I backed out. I stood beside Emily in a rented navy suit, watching her laugh with relatives who now treated me like an old family friend, and somewhere during the reception, dancing badly to a song neither of us knew the words to, she looked up at me and admitted the truth had stopped mattering to her weeks earlier. It wasn't about keeping up appearances anymore, she said. It was just easier to admit she wanted this to be real than to keep explaining why it wasn't. 6 months later, when Carol and Frank visited again, Emily didn't need to introduce me as anything. I was already there, helping set the table, already the guy who fixed her leaking faucet and remembered how she took her coffee, already, without anyone announcing it across a dinner table, exactly what she'd once called me by accident. Her boyfriend, for real this time, no whispered "please help me" required, and no more borrowed answers to give her family, only the true ones we'd finally earned together.